Okay, I'm really pleased that I've met Omar Khan at the San Francisco Club, and he grew up in Vienna, Austria, and Islamabad, Pakistan. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College, Columbia, and Stanford universities. He's researched early photography and ephemera of the subcontinent of India for 30 years, and he collects early postcards like you'll see today. He's an avid historian and award-winning web designer. He had a previous book. The one about postcards is the Paper Jewels, postcards from the Raj. And we should all wish we could have such beautiful postcard books that we would write. And he's had also a book about From Kashmir to Kabul, the photographs of John Burke and William Baker, 1860 to 1900. He's run the website Harappa.com, which is a major website on ancient Indus or Harappan civilization, which is from 3500 to 1700 BCE. And he has just retired as Chief Technology Officer at Common Sense Media in San Francisco, where he's lived since 1992. So we're very glad to welcome today Omar Khan.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. And I'm just going to share my screen and begin talking. Thank you so much, Lynn, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure, and I'm delighted to share with you some of my interests here in postcards, and especially hill station postcards, which is something new that I've been. So just to step back a little bit, the British ruled India for 200 years, from about the late 18th century till 1947. And during that period, when they came in by ship, they finally decided that it was really hot in India and they needed to find a place where they'd be a little more comfortable. So they started setting up these hill stations right on the Himalayan crest, so just right where the mountains are. And my talk today is about those hill stations, three of them in particular: Darjeeling, the very first one; Shimla, which is from where they ruled much of India for a long period of time; and Murree in Pakistan, a little known hill station to general scholarship, but the place that I know best and a place that I spent a lot of my youth and time after that as well. The one thing to know about hill stations is that the British tried to make them their centers of retreat and power. They wanted to get away from the corroding, corrupting influence of the plains of India, the heat, the masses of people, and find a place that they could create and call their own home. And that's what my talk today is about. So let's start with Darjeeling. Darjeeling is way on the east. It's north of Calcutta. It is like the first hill station that really was settled as early as the 1830s, let's say. The British began putting up things here. And this is where they wanted to collect themselves from the corroding, corrupting influence of Oriental civilization, as Dane Edwards says in his thing. And we'll then move westward to the next two hill stations. But let's start with Darjeeling. And the other thing I should say about the hill stations is that this is a hybrid land. They're unstable places, and maybe hill stations, as we shall see, is not quite the right name for them. This is the earliest postcard of Darjeeling that I know of. It's from 1898, maybe even as early as 1897. It was published by an Austrian photographer, Werner Rössler, who was based in Calcutta. And this was a part of a series of postcards he had done of that city and one of this hill station. Now, just note the train station that you can see at the very bottom, this kind of loop, the train connection in 1881 made getting to Darjeeling from Calcutta so much easier, because before it took weeks of travel for people to get up there. And note the man on the right, we're going to come back to him in a little bit. Now, this is a lithographic postcard. I think some of you are postcard collectors, many, if not all of you. I love lithographic postcards myself, the way that they put three images together, many times even more, the way the images play off of each other, the beautiful design around them. It's a very complicated sort of set of images, and I like looking at them, and I think that actually the most beautiful postcards are lithographic postcards. This is what it was like to make a lithographic postcard. So you had this very complicated press, you had these stones, you had colored stones, you had people printing this, pushing the stones so that they printed on the paper. Each time the paper had to go through for a different color. It was quite complicated. The man at the very top left is a German called Fritz Schleicher, and he actually set up the first lithographic postcard press in India, which was 1898. So as we all know, the postcards were a global medium, and they made their way around the world very, very quickly. Not only the postcard itself, but the technology to manufacture them. So as I go through this talk, I also want to talk a little bit about the different kinds of postcards and how that changed. We began with lithographic postcards in the late 1890s. We moved to color types very quickly, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. Then we went to the halftone, which we know today from dot matrix printers, from magazines and newspapers, and then finally the real photographic postcard. But especially between the first three postcards, the move to make postcards less expensive so they could become a mass medium was a very important thing around them. And they were not only means of communication, the Instagram of their time, as it were, because billions of postcards began circulating by 1900 after almost none beforehand, but it was also a business, not just a communication tool. And the drive to bring costs down and so forth, it was built on transportation networks, jobbers who would come out to India, get photographs from people, have them printed in Germany, and bring them back. It really was a very global phenomenon. And I think that's part of what makes it so interesting. These are among the very earliest color-type postcards of Darjeeling. And you will notice again, there's something with the train station here. The man on the left was the same man that you saw on the wrestler postcard before. And by the way, I'll say again, this is an Austrian printer who had set up a store in Darjeeling. And postcards began in Central Europe, and the British were a little bit late to pulling them up, to taking them up. But the man on the left is actually a Buddhist priest who was known as Sherab Gyatso. He actually was a Buryat from Siberia who came in 1870s to Darjeeling, founded a Buddhist monastery. He was a very senior figure who also supplied the British with information, and he shows up on many postcards in many different ways because he seemed like the traditional kind of Lama or Buddhist figure. And the bottom postcard, Greetings from Darjeeling, actually shows Mount Everest. And this is, as far as I know, the earliest postcard of Mount Everest. This is a postcard that in many ways puts together everything about what hill stations were for the British. You may notice all the European buildings at the bottom of the valley, the church in the back. In the foreground are a number of, at least two English women. There's a, quote, native, that is local person there standing, carrying some goods probably for them. And this kind of a postcard, which this was actually by a Hungarian or Austrian printer, CA and Company, around 1905, painted by an artist, probably from a photograph that he had, Frederick Perlberg. It's really something about the sublime. The British looked to the Himalayan mountains. As you know, the Himalayan mountains are the biggest mountains in the world. We're talking about 20,000 plus feet. This is way bigger than the Alps or anything the British had seen. So the sense of the sublime, where the British saw something that was just overwhelmingly beautiful and sort of were taken back by it, but still wanted to contain it and sort of exalt themselves by being able to capture it in an image, in a painting, in a photograph, or in this case, a postcard, was part of what made these places so rich for them. And Darjeeling, especially, as Claire Harris, professor at Oxford, who's written a fantastic book on Tibetan photography, has said, Darjeeling was a top draw for photographers, the allure of its landscape, the ethnic diversity, the very different people who lived in these areas. Each valley almost could have a different kind of population. People had been so isolated for so long. And the hill station was also clean, healthy versus the plains, which were, dangerous and diseased and, quote, too oriental. This is a person, a hill woman from Darjeeling, on the very left in a collar type, Tibetan woman, and then on the right you can see a colored version of the postcard made of her. And the very slippage into fantasy went very quickly. The thing that the British liked about the people in the hill stations was they were, quote, frank. They were free from servility. They were simpler. They were the corporeal embodiment of an ethnic, Edenic innocence, according to Dane Edwards. And you look at the woman on the left, she looks at you straight in the eye. And I think the British kind of appreciated, from their point of view, that the people were kind of different in the hills than they were sort of used to on the plains. And as Dane says, the people in the hill stations in general were, quote, a moral antiseptic to the intractable and unfathomable subjects who occupied the plains. I should say that there was a lot of hard work involved in serving the British up here. The British went to the hill stations to get away from the, quote, natives. They relied on the natives enormously to be there. carrying the goods up. And these are two little kids on the right carrying a suitcase and another bag. You can imagine this was sometimes a very long walk. Even once the train came to get up to one of the places where the British stayed, a hotel or a villa, was a long, long walk, and it was actually backbreaking work. On the left, you'll see a woman carrying a log of wood, and you'll see more such scenes. The labor involved in supporting the British up here was very, very difficult. And sometimes the viceroys would just come in and just command 1,000 villagers to work for them and give them very little money, basically just enough to eat. So there was a lot of maybe resentment under the surface from the people to serve the British being up in the hill stations. The other big thing in Darjeeling, and Darjeeling, as you may know today from Darjeeling tea, which is still world famous and some of the best tea in the world, was that a lot of tea plantations were set up here. Once the British had gotten the tea plants over from China, they planted and found that this was the right climate for it. So you will see they built these kinds of bungalows with sloping roofs, so the rain and if there was any snow could easily be taken down. There'd be a veranda, and then you'd have the tea plantation right out there. And then you'll see all these, many of them women, picking the teas in baskets. We'll look at in a minute. And then right in the foreground is some, Britisher, probably the owner, telling them what to do. And this is one of those early postcards from around 1900. Small image, a lot of space around because you could only write on the front of the postcard. As some of you may know, in the early days of the postcard, so we're talking about 1898 till about 1905, these magazines came up that were sort of run by the people who had, like we are having here, a postcard club, and really sort of pushed the medium and talked about it. And a fellow called E.W. Richardson, who was the man who put together the Picture Postcard magazine, which I was able to find some issues at Oxford's library a few years ago. Actually, this is a postcard of a bhutia coolie. A coolie is a laborer shown here. And next to him, that basket is actually a tea basket. This is where the tea leaves were put into. And he's sitting on a box where the dry tea leaves would then be sent to Calcutta and from there be shipped abroad, when people would put them in their teas. And Bhutias were one of those names, kind of strange, quote, opaque ethnic category used by the British to describe the people there. And Darjeeling was very much a contact zone, as Claire Harris describes, where Europeans occupied the same space as long-established Himalayan communities in a condition of highly unequal power relations. And postcards were part of what represented the hill stations to the people in the plains, to the people abroad who the British sent these cards to. And they really helped give an image of these places and help perpetuate the myth of these hill stations being these fantastic, fabulous places where people could retreat and withdraw and find themselves. But they also illustrated the hard labor, the workers, and all the bits and pieces that went into making the hill station also a center of commerce. Here is a woman coolie, a hill coolie girl, as she's described here. You'll see the stamps put in the front, and we'll talk about what the meaning of those were in a moment. But people, as you know, like to sending a postcard. They were so novel and interesting. They tried to make a statement with it, sometimes by putting a stamp in front, having it stamped in a certain way. You can also see from the left postcard, which is a bit earlier and older than the one on the right, where very quickly there was a demand on the part of the customer to see things in greater close-up. So you'd then get a version from the same firm. This is Johnston and Hoffman, a Calcutta firm, doing the postcard with a closer view of the woman. I should say, as we go through this, you can also see the difference between these two postcards in the tones. I typically restore all the postcards digitally, which is obviously not the physical postcard. So many of the postcards that you'll see here look fairly good because we've actually worked with a professional to make them look as closely as possible to what we think they all looked like when they originally came out. It was a very popular postcard where you shows three different women looking right back at you. And I will say this. Obviously, the British were representing people, and in fact, many of these were European photographers in this case, who might have been making those photographs to begin with. But there's a lot of agency on the part of these three women. They look straight back at the camera. They're being looked at, but they're also, happy to stare back at you and sort of try and sort of decenter that unequal power relationship a little bit. And I think we should just recognize that when we look at these postcards of these people. So they are being categorized and sort of, and there's a lot of prejudice in many ways that the British brought to bear, but the people also, look back their own way. These are two other postcards. On the right is a milkman, and the British were really obsessed with milk and clean milk. So they had, a Bhutia milkman, and in the very back you might see a church in England, and he's posing in a studio. On the right was a master of curios, showing this enormous ibex or sheep that they must have, shot out there. And there's a sort of bit of a representation of colonialism in this as well. Postcards were a very dynamic thing, and there was so much competition between the different publishers. People were always trying to outdo or have the coolest, neatest, fancy. So you had these kinds of postcards come up too, in nice little frames that looked more like paintings. On the left, you have a Tibetan Lama. This was probably the most iconic image of a Tibetan Lama, and it appeared on so many different postcards. So once a photographer had made an image and he had the photograph, he could then sell it to different publishers who would then put it in their own format of a postcard. And on the right, you have a Nepalese woman, and you might notice the little sort of stamp put down in the front. Some of you may know that there was a whole language of stamps on postcards, and the way you position the stamp and what color the stamp might be was also a message to the receiver. In this case, a red stamp in this position in the British sort of lexicon of stamp positions meant write soon. And other ways of tilting stamps meant I love you, or you don't write me, or I want to hear from you. And there was a whole language. You actually have postcards called the language of stamps that sort of decoded all the different positions of stamps for people. So it's very interesting, especially around this period, to find those kinds of postcards. This is the great mountain that you can see from Darjeeling called Kanchenjunga. And this was a collar type postcard, which was then hand stenciled in India, done in a studio. The studio in this case was D. Macropolo and Co., which was a very big tobacco company. He actually was a Greek man who had settled and built up a big company in Egypt and then came over to Bombay and then Calcutta, taking Egyptian and Turkish tobacco, but also sold postcards. And it was I love buying these kinds of postcards that are hand tinted in different ways. Each one is slightly different, but sometimes they're very beautiful objects on their own. The other very popular postcard of Darjeeling was this Sunday market postcard, where all the different tribes and people would come and gather in the bazaar, and where you could actually meet the people, see the goods that they sort of did, and this whole sense of exchange and different people's meeting really came out very nicely. My favorite postcard publisher in Darjeeling is a company called S&D Singh and Company. And what they did was make real photo postcards, and now we're talking about the 1920s roughly. Every postcard was titled in ink by the firm and then signed. On the left is a black and white postcard of two Nepali girls, but on the left is a Tibetan merchant, and you may look that they've sort of cut his figure out from the rest and then hand painted the colors on each part of his costume, which I find very nice. These are hard cards to find, but they can often be very beautiful. My favorite postcard from the studio is Sunrise from Tiger Hill, which is also from Darjeeling, probably around 1925, 1930. And it's almost psychedelic. I think it fits very well in San Francisco. So that is Darjeeling, the first hill station, also a big tea plantation. It was tied to Bengal. But let's turn now to Shimla. And Shimla is the place where the British could really stretch their so-called psychic limbs in a familiar environment. It's nowhere more true than in this hill station, which was much further up north. And from the mid-19th century on, the British really liked this place. And the whole viceroy would move with his entire camp of 1,000, 2,000 people every year to come up here because it was so much cooler and so much healthier. And this became actually functionally the capital of the Raj for a good period of time, from about 1880 till 1920. This is where some of Rudyard Kipling's most memorable characters, like Mrs. Hawksby, lived. It was only connected by rail in 1903, but still managed to become a really important center of British power. This is what a sort of long view of Shimla looks like, looking towards Jacko, which is the hill on the right, I think. I want to talk about the word hill station for a moment. Hill station conjures a really safe and nice place, but actually, most of these hill stations were clinging to the side of a hill. And it was actually a very precarious existence at points. Sometimes an earthquake might come, and then a lot of damage could be done. There was an earthquake in 1905 near here, which actually destroyed much of the town of Kangra. These things were sliding down all the time. It was actually a sort of difficult place to be, not only because it took so long to get up there, but because there was getting water there, chances of fire. Sometimes we had fires in some of the hill stations that burnt down a lot of the stuff. So it was actually a bit of a precarious and not as idyllic an existence as we might think. This is one of the most famous views of Shimla. It's a place called Annandale, which really was a flat region about a quarter of a mile, which was completely flattened out and became a big picnic ground. And you really see the richness of the colotype here, the beauty of the trees that you can see in the back. Now, one thing I should say about the trees at hill stations, these may still be the original trees, but at most hill stations, the trees were cut down so quickly and deforested so quickly to build up the buildings that they would then have to bring in trees from other places to replant them. And they very quickly realized that taking down all the trees was not a very good thing. So trees were brought in from Australia, from Japan in some cases, until they found the right tree that could then be regrown here. And in a couple of other postcards, I'll show you some regrown trees, but these might be original ones. I'm not quite sure. But I'm just going to quote to you for a second from Edward Buck, sort of the master historian of Shimla, whose book in 1904, Shimla Past and Present, he wrote, "There is possibly no name connected with Shimla, which to thousands of Anglo-Indians, past and present, can revive more memories of a pleasant nature than that of Annandale. This small patch of tableland, about a quarter mile in diameter, was a picnic playground, a polo playground. It was used, for Maharaja's matches, a whole bunch of different things. The name actually came from a Major Kennedy who was so struck by the beauty of the valley that he named it after a woman that I think he had, been in love with at some point in Britain or Scotland, called Anna. So he called it Annandale, but the people quickly sort of corrupted that to Anandale, which sounds in Hindi probably, or in the local languages more easy to say. So it became Annandale, and that's what it was called. And a lot of stories by the British were told about this very place in particular. This is also a postcard view from the Grand Hotel looking down. On the left, it's by Fred Bremner, the first postcard that I showed you. He was a Scotsman, actually, who came out to what is now Pakistan and also had an office in Shimla, lived there for like 30, 40 years, was a very good photographer, and also made a lot of the very earliest postcards of the area. The postcard on the right is a very similar view made by Raphael Tuck and Company, which ultimately became the very biggest postcard publisher of India. Some of you may know they made postcards of America and all over the world. And it's part of the shift of what happened. The postcard on the left was, probably printed in Germany, as even though the Central Europeans, Germans and Austrians in particular, may have invented and been the first real postcard printers and publishers, the British ultimately took over. And because they had such a big empire, Raphael Tuck and Company became kind of the major postcard publisher. It was a German Jewish businessman, actually originally from Eastern Europe, who set this up. They probably printed about 1,000 different postcards of India, and those postcards were still popular into the 1930s, and they really started taking off around 1905. And you can see what color did, and many of their postcards were in color, and color really brought another dimension to it. And you can see the people in the sort of bottom standing attention in a way, sort of humbly to whoever the British person might be. Shimla talking about wood for a second, they consumed about 250,000 cubic feet of timber per year in the 1890s when building was at its max. So you can imagine reforestation and so forth became a really big issue, but they finally got that down. Ultimately, it became more like 85,000 cubic feet per year of wood was consumed, for fires and construction and all of that. You'll also notice in this picture, this is the main mall in Shimla looking down to the church, Anglican church in the middle. On the left, you get a sense of what was known as Himalayan Swiss Gothic style, which was where they adapted sort of Swiss chalet type style to the Himalayas by creating these verandas and very gabled buildings. And that became a unique signature of many of the British buildings in these hill stations. This is the very first hospital up there in Shimla, known as the Old Ripon Hospital. And Dane describes this style as it was distinguished by multi-storied structures with chimneys thrusting up from steep roof lines, numerous gables and terraces cutting against the vertical grain, and ornately covered fretwork framing the eaves, windows, and doors. The result looked like a cross between a Victorian garden villa and a Swiss chalet. So this was part of the British trying to make the hill station their own home, but also making whatever accommodations made sense to them for the climate that they lived in. And having a veranda and covering the veranda because of the rain and the fog would make sense. And this is what they did in this case. This is one of the better examples of the sort of Himalayan Swiss Gothic style. This is the Viceroy's Palace on the left, which was built in the early 1900s. And then the bottom is the gardens right outside the palace. If you look at the bottom postcard, the very back of that house at the top is shown there. And this whole sense of building gardens and creating green spaces and sort of conquering the landscape physically to make it more a part of what they were used to and what they would have liked to see and make it their home is part of what the whole construction of the hill station was for the British psyche. And these are both Tux postcards, and again, color halftone postcards with a little caption on the back were their forte. This is that Grand Hotel that we saw the views from before. This is, again, a very beautifully hand-tinted postcard. It was originally a collotype, then hand-tinted properly, probably in India. And you'll notice in the front, there's the European, man and, his wife in the cart, and then all the different people around them. And you'll see many of these postcards of British families in their homes up in the hills. They were typically a family of 4 or 5 people might have 15 people or 20 people to support them. Gardeners, cooks, bearers, someone to take care of the kids, horses, someone to take care of the horses and all that kind of stuff. So it was a very sort of multitudinous existence out there. They didn't really quite get away in the sense that they may have wanted to from the rest of the subcontinent. And this is both a very interesting kind of style of postcard, having this gold frame out around it again, trying to compete and find something different. This is the club in Kasauli, which is a hill station right near Shimla. And you can see the clubs were places where the British typically did not let Indians in unless they were Maharajas or very prominent people and really could do whatever they wanted. And often it was hard for women to get into these places as well. These are 3 postcards by a man called William Poole, who was a painter who lived in Shimla. He was an amateur artist, and he made these postcards, and they were then printed by I think it was Thacker Spink Company, which was a retailer up in the hills. And you'll notice very nicely done flowers here, but also the people are like almost flowers in the top left postcard. You can barely see them under the tree. And then on the left, you'll see Simla during the monsoons when the mists come up from the plains, which I know from Murray is an incredibly beautiful thing to watch because the scene in front of you is constantly changing. And at the end of the day, all of this warm air creates this fog, like in San Francisco almost, but even more beautiful because what you see behind the fog is really spectacular. So this is captured by him on the left. And then on the right is sort of looking up the bazaar, and I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the bazaars a little bit. These are from H.A. Mirza and Company, which became the biggest publisher in North India in the early 20th century. The very top is a hospital that the British did. And here you can see a little bit more of the modernism, the sort of straight, even though it's still Himalayan Gothic style, a little bit more of the clear lines. This was built just for Europeans. It cost 5 rupees a day, which was a fortune to keep there, 20 beds, but it was soon overflowing with Indians. And you also notice that these were printed in Germany by, I think it was Nackstedt und Neta. And you'll see that they have the same color palette for whatever the situation is, whatever the kind of postcard is. And this is how they sort of had their sunsets and all of that. On the right is Lakkar Bazaar in Shimla, which was known as a place where monkeys would come in and sort of flood the bazaar and drive everybody out, and all the stores would be shut until the monkeys were driven away. And I like very much the fact that monkeys and the rulers of the Raj shared the same place together. This is the temple on one of the hills, which was actually full of monkeys, and was a very sort of sacred place because Hanuman was one of the Hindu gods, the monkey god, is also a sacred creature in many strains of Hinduism. It's also a very interesting place because there was the son of a local French photographer called Charles de Russet, who he dropped out of the nearby British Bishop Cotton School at the age of 17. And he came up to this temple and sat under a tree. And he was accepted by the monkeys immediately and all the fakirs who sort of hung out. And he became known as the leopard fakir because of the headdress that he wore as he wandered through the bazaar. He later retired to another temple and is said to have forgotten how to speak French, but he spent his entire life here. And this life was idle, happy, and contented without any anxiety about the morrow, as Edward Buck wrote in the 1890s. So some of the British people actually found the hill stations irresistible and became quote natives. I wanted to turn again to the labor issue. This is a picture of a Shimla timber coolie, and just imagine what it was like carrying these planks of wood. And I remember in my youth at Murray, seeing a number of men especially who were completely hunchbacked from all that they had carried up the hills, heavy loads, big, huge slabs of meat or wood between the buildings. So there was a very kind of, oppressive side to this as well. So the Paharis, which are the hill station people, were really loved by the British. And they would say, I think one comment about the Paharis around Shimla was that they're such docile people that they hardly require to be ruled, as a Times correspondent put after 1857. The truth is that some of the best fighters, Garhwalis, and you may have heard of Gurkhas, who are not too far from here, also came from this area. So it depended on what the British might need. And Kipling would write about these people. And in one case, he wrote about one Pahari woman up here. Lisbeth had a Greek face, one of those faces people paint so often and see so seldom. She was of a pale ivory color, and for her race, extremely tall. Also, she possessed eyes that were wonderful, and had she not been dressed in the abominable print cloths affected by missions, you would, meeting her on the hillside, unexpectedly have thought her the original Diana of the Romans going out to slay. The other thing that's interesting about hill stations is this was the one place in the British Raj where there were as many women, at least, as there were men. And they were actually the nurseries for the ruling race, because many British officers continued to serve in the plains, but their wives and kids would spend their times up in the hill stations getting educated. And the women who were there without husbands were known as grass widows, and they apparently had a very good time up in the hills. And Mrs. Hawksby, one of Kipling's most famous characters, and she appears in a number of his short stories, was always trying to arrange, affairs and relationships and all of that. And Kipling writes about her. She was clever, witty, brilliant, and sparkling beyond most of her kind, but possessed of many devils of malice and mischievousness. She could be nice, though, even to her own sex. So what fools men are was her sort of way of sort of looking at the world. The postcard on the right, I won't say more about, except that it's called A Mountain Nymph. There's a man about to jump into a pool of water. Another group of men are waiting there. How it got this title, I cannot guess. My favorite postcard of Shimla is this very sort of abstract one, which is just icicles. And I think it's probably a house that's completely covered in snow because we see the ladder up there. But it's a very interesting sort of postcard that makes you wonder about how, what exactly it is. It's kind of mysterious. Let's turn now to Murray. Murray is all the way on the west there, also facing the Himalayas, also spectacular views. It's now in Pakistan. And I grew up in Austria, but when we were 13, my dad decided to move back to Pakistan. And having known the Alps and skied and all of that, and we were living in the plains in Islamabad, about an hour or two drive from Murray. So I could not but wait to get up there during the summers because it was so nice and beautiful. This is a sort of image of the whole Murray Bazaar. On the left is the church. Typically, a church was, the crowning piece of one of these hill stations. This was an Anglican church. There was the mall that sort of went right by the church. Now, there were many parts of the day where local people, Indians, were not allowed to be in the mall. It was just for the British. And in fact, one of Pakistan's most prominent businessmen in his autobiography remembers his father telling a story about in 1906, he was riding a horse somewhere in Murray, and a Britisher stopped him and told him to get off the horse because he could not stand an Indian being higher in position than he was. So we shouldn't forget about the racism and other stuff that was going on here. If you look at this bazaar, the top stores that were right facing the mall, these were the posh stores. This is where the British went to shop. Some of these were actually owned by Europeans. But as you went down in the bazaar, obviously you got much poorer. This is the area where British people did not go, but the local people who served them had to go. And then a lot of the refuse and waste would go down. And the Murray Bazaar in 1875, a lot of this completely burnt down in a fire. So they had to come and bring, better rules on how to take care of it. This is a very beautiful view, actually, a collotype. You can see from the very bottom, this is made by my favorite photographer from the area, a man called Balji, who was an army photographer who made these really beautiful, big, collotype, these big albumin prints, and then made postcards from them. So it's very rich in detail, and then had them hand tinted. Here you can see the snow. And then here are shots in the summer of some of the roads around where you can see the very nice use of color and sort of giving it a kind of a fantastic look. This is the soccer field at Murray, where I also played as a kid once. You can see the church in the background. This is a very interesting postcard because it's one of those postcards that just captured the moment that a goal seems to have been scored. Because if you look at everybody cheering, raising their hands, the ball seems to be in the foreground bottom next to the man in the white, who is probably the policeman, a policeman or army officer right to his left. You can see a little ball that seems to have just gone in. And it was a big match. I think this was in 1912. If I remember correctly, when so many people came out to watch this game. So it's one of the places where postcards sort of became kind of journalistic and sort of carried the news, as did this postcard from 1914, which is titled on the left. I'll read it to you. The place where Kenneth Hiscock, I think the name is Hitchcock, fell over on the evening of 26/5/1914 and was found about 5 a.m. the next morning. Fell 200 feet, Hanspur. And this is a photographer. So this little boy with the sort of, whatever, his head bandaged here, had fallen down and was only found the next morning, which I think is pretty amazing that he survived, because there are a lot of wild animals here. And the fact that he made it is great. And this was celebrated on a postcard. The other thing that made hill stations very popular and contributed to their population was that the British built some really fine educational institutions up here, not only for their kids, but especially for Anglo-Indian kids. There were a lot of children who were of mixed race. The British would have children with local women and then didn't know quite what to do with them, not send them back to England. And they sent back many of their own kids, but they put them in convents and different schools. This is the convent of Jesus and Mary, which I visited many times. And even when I went there, in the late 80s and early 90s, there were a number of Irish and German and Belgian sisters here who I would talk to and have conversations with. Spectacular views looking over the plains from these places. Today, these are still very popular and successful schools. There's no question of conversion going on. But in many cases, especially at this school, these are Pathan girls who come from Peshawar and what was formerly Northwest Frontier Province. And the sisters are very happy to educate them properly and give them some sense of reading. And there have been different schools, like there's an Anglican college in Lahore in Pakistan, Foreman Christian College, which was founded by American missionaries, which the government nationalized some years ago, but was unable to run properly. So they gave it back to the American Presbyterian Church, which has taken it over and restored its reputation very nicely. This is a postcard of a British Army general, prancing around in Murray. I will say this, the Army made its headquarters in these hill stations, but they did a terrible job of running wars. There were catastrophic wars managed from Shimla especially, not only the First and Second Afghan War, but World War I, they managed the British campaign in Mesopotamia. And thousands of Indian soldiers, actually, they made up much of the army, were killed in Kutar Mara and so forth. So London took control of the sort of forces back and then managed to, reconquer what is now Iraq in those days. So I don't know if it was the hill stations or what it was, but they did not do a very good job running the armies from there. This is a group of British people in a play for some kind of Murray Brewery Cup. There was a brewery up here I'll show you in a second. There are two little Indian boys on the very left, seated on the foreground. You can note them with the darker skin. The men are, I don't know, it's a Gilbert and Sullivan play. I'm not quite sure, but they're dressed up for some kind of a play for the Murray Cup, Brewery Cup. And this is the Murray Brewery, which it had burned down in 1947. It was this is actually from around 1860, an old albumen photograph that became a postcard later on when it was built. And they actually still exist as a company today, and they supply a lot of soft drinks, but also beer and so forth to foreigners. And I used to love to stop here when I would drive up to Murray because it's a beautiful ruin. These buildings are kind of sort of half ruined, but have such sort of beauty and charm despite that fact. This is the church in snow. Very interesting postcard. This is where I sort of one afternoon, I think it was in the early 1990, maybe 1991, wandered in and started talking to the priest who sort of ran the place, the father, and managed to find the record of a photographer called John Burke, an Irish photographer whose pictures I had seen at the Getty in Los Angeles, but nothing was known about it. He was one of the first war photographers. So that's where I began sort of tracking down his life, and then spent about 10 years writing my first book and finding out about all the illegitimate kids he had at other churches, at Roman Catholic churches whose names were inscribed there. And there was a big difference between the Anglicans and the Protestants and the wealth they had, and then the Roman Catholics and the Irish at these hill stations as well. The other thing to note in this picture is the camera at the bottom right, which the photographer has kept in, I think, intentionally, almost as a self-referential thing, which is kind of interesting. This is one of my favorite postcards of Murray because even though the hill stations were begun for the British, as time went by, they were really taken over by the local populations because Maharajas would then build their own houses here. Indians had to come up to support the British, of course. Some of those merchants became quite wealthy. And over time, Indians, obviously, and Pakistanis later on as well, after 47, sort of took over themselves. And you see here, an Indian gentleman, this is from about probably the 1920s, maybe early 1930s, sort of walking into the hill station, carrying his own suitcase, slightly blurry because this is obviously one of those pictures with the longer exposure. You can see one or two British people sort of up, even a woman in the in the middle of the image. But the transition of the hill station from a British ruled place to a place where the local population began to play an ever bigger role and finally took over the hill stations is part of the story of these places that was not intended. As Dane Edwards puts it in his book about them, The Magic Mountains, hill stations were at the heart of the British effort to define and defend the boundaries that set them apart from Indians and that sustained their identity as agents of a superior culture. But it could not last, of course. This is a very interesting to me postcard. This is a colored postcard from the early 1940s. Very few such postcards, real photo postcard. I don't quite know how it came about. I think it was probably, maybe a one-off or something. But the hill stations began fading after World War I by about 1920 because it became much cheaper for people to go back, the British to go back for vacation, back to England or Scotland or wherever. And then wealthy Indians came and took over these places much more. And Murray in particular got a new lease of life in the 1960s when Pakistan's capital was moved from Karachi up to Islamabad, which is about an hour and a half away. Even now it's about 45 minutes away. They built such a nice highway. So today, hill stations both in Pakistan and in India are flourishing. In fact, they're groaning under the weight of all the people who come up there. They're overcrowded. There's not enough water. It's very hard to provide services. I don't even enjoy going to Murray anymore because I hardly recognize it. There's so many people there, and it's really hard to even find water sometimes. So they've become very different, but they've been absorbed, into our own country, of course. But you still have those spectacular views, of course, of places. For the last image, let me just turn to, as a postscript, let's turn to Ooty, which is a hill station way down south that I managed to visit a couple of years ago. And in a single postcard from there, I can almost tell you the entire story of the hill station. This is the view of Ooty on the right. All the trees here came from abroad. I think they're an Australian species that were then replanted. The lake in the middle of the hill station was created by the British because they dammed up a river that was flowing through the area. It's a flatter kind of area. So it was a lot of recreation by the British, who then built these botanical gardens and all these other things to make the landscape more into their image. On the left is a Toda girl. Toda is one of the tribes that especially is known for this area. Again, she's looking at you straight into the face. That's what the British liked. At the very bottom, you will see the kind of carriage that was used to bring people up there. And Wiele and Klein, this was again a German firm that had been in Madras. So nothing is simple with hill stations. They were both pristine and constructed, victims and beneficiaries of a European reality transposed and transfiguring of distant lands. They stuck and for many good reasons, found their place, are now, a flourishing part of Indian, Pakistani, and even Sri Lankan reality. Foreignness haunts them, and, native life haunted them before when they were under British rule as well. So they, to me, remain very interesting places, not only for their beauty, but for all the cultural complexities that they bring up. So there you go. That is my one last thing I wanted to say was, so if you're interested in doing any more explorations about hill stations, on the left is Dane Kennedy. This is a UC Berkeley book, The Magic Mountains, maybe 10, 20 years ago. Excellent way of looking at them. In the middle is a very nice book by Claire Harris, professor at Oxford, on photography in Tibet. And on the right is my book, Paper Jewels, which is the story of postcards throughout the Indian subcontinent before 1947. So thank you. That's it. I have a website where you can see more of these postcards, Instagram feed, Facebook page. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I'm always happy to correspond with people and learn more about postcards. And with that, let me stop my share and see if you guys want to ask me anything about this. Stop share. Okay, there you go.
Omar, that was fantastic. I was so impressed with that. I know nothing about that area. In my own mind, I was thinking, I always thought of India being a very crowded, very dense, densely populated area. And of course, the places that you showed, at least back then, seemed like they were kind of mountain type settings, obviously, high elevation. Not very many people, by comparison.
Yeah, that's right. That northern belt on the Himalayas was at that time, but yeah, much less populated for sure.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks.
Questions? Anybody? I think Lynn.
Thank you very much. It was great. Are there any books on the language of stamps?
I don't know of a book. I do have a postcard which shows it. I do not know of any book. That's actually an interesting question. Maybe someone should write a book. But if you ever, if you want a copy, I have it somewhere. Send me an email. I'm gladly send you a copy of a postcard. And there were different postcards by the British, and the French had some as well, depicting what each different kind of stamp meant.
I know that we had a couple of questions. I was asking about the altitude of that area that you're in up against the Himalayas. Were those towns, at a high?
Oh, yes.
High.
Oh, absolutely. Murray is at 8,000 feet. Shimla is probably around the same. I think Darjeeling is a little bit less. I'm not super sure about the other two, but I know Murray's at a good 8,000 feet, and you definitely feel the height up there.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of trees were those? You said that they actually imported some of the trees because they were clear cut so heavily. What type of trees were they?
I mean, they're pine trees, they're deodar trees, which are the sort of local sort of trees. I don't know the names of the trees so well. Sorry, but I know it feels like a pine forest, but exactly, maybe they're Douglas firs too, who knows?
That's beautiful. It's a beautiful area.
Yeah, it is spectacular. I mean, just looking at the mountains, I mean, those are 20,000-foot peaks, right? So even from Murray, you can see way into, Kashmir, and these are some of the most beautiful areas in the world, and certainly the highest mountains.
It's gorgeous. Absolutely. Yeah, that was a thrill just to watch it, just to see the cards.
Thanks.
So Hal Ottaway was asking about that magazine, the Picture Postcard magazine, and it sounded like you found it at a university library or something?
Yes. I found this this was at the Bodleian in Oxford, where I found it. And it's very interesting because he was a real Edward Richardson was a real promulgator of the postcard. He was saying, look at the Europeans, they've got such nice postcards out of Germany and Austria. Why can't we do the same thing in Britain? And we own all these lands, so why can't we have postcards of them? So he really helped popularize the craft. And you had a good magazine in Austria as well, even just a little bit earlier. So there was really a sense of building a community and paying attention to the best printers and publishers, creating competitions. Tux had a big prize for the biggest postcard collection, typically always won by women who could collect the most Tux postcards each year, and they'd get like a 1,000-pound prize or something like that, which was enormous. So there was a lot of community building that helped make this practice become popular, in the public realm.
You can hear me now, can't you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. The question that it wasn't really a question, it was an observation. I noticed that in a lot of the postcards that you showed, the earlier postcards, the dress of the native people that you were showing reminded me very much of American Indian type postcards that I've seen of that. And there can't be a similarity, or I guess there has to be a similarity, but even to the point where I think in one of the cards you showed a guy looked like he was smoking a peace pipe, and very similar to American Indian type photographs that I've seen in the past. I don't know whether there's any correlation or not, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's coincidence. I have like William Henry Jackson postcards that of Native American people, and you could think they could be in India. It's stunning sometimes, the similarities and the textile and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's funny. And there's certain motifs like a swastika, for example, which was a sort of a Native American symbol, but also from India, way in the early times. So there are some strange correspondences, true.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you.
We can, until Dawn comes, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Khan. That was really, really good presentation. Very interesting. I also have seen, like what Shav was inquiring or bringing up, many just people, native Fijians, cards with them, and they would look straight in the camera also. That look, that can almost look the same thing. And also Oceania, different islands, different exotic cards that I've collected through Donald Price that's on right here. And they have this similar look and similar style of card. Very interesting. Mr. Khan, I'd like to ask you about the trains near there. Are you aware of close by trains that are near these hill stations?
Yes, there was a train that went up to Darjeeling, I think, 1880s, I think, and early 1900s up to Shimla. So yes, Murray, they were going to build a train station too, but they've never done that. They've just built a highway. But yeah, that was a really big part of getting people up there, because otherwise it is an arduous 1 or 2 day journey sometimes from the plane to go up to that height. Yeah, no, trains made a big difference.
I think I remember reading an article a long time ago out of Saudi Aramco journal that one of the train lines, I think I have to go back and look. I think they were talking about one of the train lines, but I would be interested in also, I like the cancellations, if there was train mail or something like that on those cards.
Yes, I don't. Yeah, interesting. I don't think I have.
If they were doing that, processing the mail on the car.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
One other observation that I saw on one of your postcards, I noticed that there were a lot of monkeys around that church that you were showing. I have to assume that monkeys are just there naturally. They just run free, correct?
Absolutely. And then, they're thought of as sacred animals. So people feed them, take care of them, don't hunt them, give them free space. So yes, in that sense, they flourish.
This is the thing that Ronnie just sent us. It's an example. I think there's more than one version of this out there. And I guess it must be similar to what Omar has. Thank you.
Yeah,
Ronnie.
I tried unmuting.
I read somewhere that those stamps language was more a gimmick than actually a real language. So if you agree with your correspondence, it works. Otherwise, most people did not know the code. So it's more like a fairy tale, no, a legends than a reality, but I'm not sure.
You might be right, but I have seen so many cards with stamps put in such odd positions that I think there was enough people who knew what was going on to make them work.
I found for World War I in Italy, apparently you couldn't write too many words, somebody told me, and so people were writing under the stamp.
That too.
And then they will put the stamp on top, and so that didn't count as words, and they were able
That's
to
true.
get, so I found some that were scratched out to try to find the rest of the message.
That's true, yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask Omar about Kipling's stay in Simla, because his books talk a lot about Simla. What do you know about Kipling's stay there?
Oh, yes. So so actually, he grew up, I think he was born in Lahore, born in Bombay. I think he grew up in Lahore. And then after going to England, came back and then was in Lahore in the 1880s. And he worked for a newspaper there. And then he moved to Pioneer Allahabad. He may have moved to Shimla. I'm not sure. I think he spent summers there. I don't know how long he actually lived there. But he did spend some time there. I'm not 100% sure. But he wrote for the Pioneer, which came out of Allahabad. And he may have been their Shimla correspondent for some time. This would have been like later 1880s, maybe very early 1890s, before he actually came to San Francisco and then, ended up in Vermont for a while too. What
do you think of his descriptions of Simla in his book?
I think they're hilarious. I think they're great. I mean, I have many problems with his colonial and, racist mentality, but he was a fantastic writer. And he was also a great critic of the British. He made fun of them and Mrs. Hawksby and all the goings on up there. And he really, it was a brilliant writer for sure.
Well, which is the book people should read as Kipling?
Two books, Plain Tales from the Hills, which is his book of short stories, which is Mrs. Hawksby figures in there in a big way. And a lot of his earliest short stories and funniest short stories, Lisbeth and others are all in there. So that's a great short story book. And then Kim, which I think is 1901, which is a story that goes all across northern India and is about a Buddhist Lama and a young boy who follows the Lama, is another great book, a superb novel, and very interesting. And actually the deeper meanings people have argued about in many different ways, not quite as racist as one might think.
The Great Trunk Road he wrote about.
Yeah, exactly. Grand Trunk Road, that's right.
What happened in the winter up there in those hill towns? Were they sort of abandoned by the British? Or
yes.
Did families stay up there, the children?
No, many times they were abandoned and people just came back then in the summer. But there would be some people who stayed. So that's why you'd get some photographs and so forth. But yeah, they were largely abandoned by the British during the snowy times, especially Murray. I think Darjeeling less so.
I noticed that at least the towns that you were showing, there were quite a few Catholic churches, and so is Catholicism kind of a general religion up in that area? I wouldn't imagine that would be the case.
Well, so I'll tell you what's happened. What happened was the British brought their religion, obviously. The ruling class of the British were Anglican, Protestant, and those were the nicest churches, the churches at the top of the hill stations. But the Irish soldiers and the lower classes among the British were typically Catholic. and they would build much poorer churches in other parts of the hill station. So like the photographer I wrote about, John Burke, was a Catholic, Irish Catholic. So he initially went to the Catholic churches. He actually had an illegitimate kid who was inscribed in one Catholic church in this town and another and another. But then he married the daughter of the head chairman of the board of the Anglican church. And he was married in the Anglican church. But there was, I mean, you can just, if you look at the churches at the hill stations, all with the Protestant churches have much more beautiful, lovely organ, great decor inside. And then you have a much poorer class for the Catholic churches because that's where the soldiers were.
You say that a lot of the soldiers, a good proportion of them were Irish?
Especially in the early days, which is the latter part of the 19th century, a very good proportion were Irish because they were fleeing the potato famines. And people like John Burke came and his father came because there was, obviously famine in Ireland. So they would serve with the British. Correct.
That's very interesting in itself. Very interesting.
I'll ask one more question. In Darjeeling, why were all the roofs of the houses blue?
Sorry, the houses were blue?
Blue roofs.
Blue roofs?
Yeah. Maybe
I don't know.
The guy that made the postcards who painted them all blue.
Yeah, so there was a blue tone postcard, which may have been the example that I showed you at the very beginning. But I don't know that all the roofs were blue or they were just painted that color. And sometimes when they hand painted postcards, sometimes they put imaginary colors there, right? It was the color that dye that they had available. So it's not necessarily a realistic depiction of the color.
Tell me, Omar, I gave you all my Indian postcards. Were some of them hill station cards? Do you remember?
I think there were. I don't remember exactly which one, but I think there might have been.
Send
Yes.
me your wonderful book, The Jewels of the Lodge. Your book. It was a beautiful book.
Yes.
Tell people again about that book.
Yeah. I mean, Paper Jewels, which is my book, which is a history of the postcard in India from 1892. By the way, the very first postcards of India were done here. Yes, Lynn is holding it up. Were done by the Singer sewing machine manufacturing company in America, 1892, for the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. So they were the earliest printed advertising postcards. But then my book tells the story of postcards in India, from the very first European produced postcards, both there and by artists, by place. And we cover a lot of the hill stations and sort of tell the story of postcards. The interesting thing about the postcard is it began as a tool for the colonists to come and represent the places that they had captured and send messages back home. But by 1947, when the independence movement was at its strongest, Indians were using postcards for their own political reasons, celebrating their potential independence, supporting their political parties. Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, all these people appeared on postcards. So there was a use of this sort of object, this product, changed and shifted just like the population of the hill stations over time. And that's part of what makes it interesting.
Mr. Khan, can I also add, today, one of those places look more like a modern place for people to rent out homes, like Airbnb. Is it more like that today, or is it those places?
Good question. I don't know about Airbnbs. So many wealthy people have houses up there that they go to. There are a lot of hotels. A lot of the old British hotels have been repurposed and are now used by Indians and Pakistanis. So yeah, this is a tourist place. This is where tourist people go up from the plains. Punjabis flood these hill stations. And for people from Pakistan, for example, it's great to go to a hill station. It's great weather. It feels a little bit like you're going to a foreign place. You have spectacular views. Ice cream for kids, horse rides for kids. We used to ride horses all the time. I mean, there's a lot there which make them very appealing. Any other questions?
Of the places that you showed along the northern end of India, then you went down south, and yet the postcards that you showed were kind of the view, with the exception of the mountains in the background, was very similar. And I'm wondering, being that far south in the country, how that could be.
Yeah, because what happens at the so India is a very complicated geologic terrain, and in the south, in Tamil Nadu, where Uti is, actually the mountains come up again. There are higher hills. It's not as high as the Himalayas. It's more like 5,000-6,000 feet, and it's more rolling hills. And there are also a lot of tea plantations there. So that's how you get a view of Uti Uttakamund, as I showed. And then there are even hill stations near Bombay and in Maharashtra. So there were 65 hill stations or so that the British had at different places. So wherever there was an elevation and the temperature was a little bit cooler, even the big city of Bangalore was kind of a hill station in a way that ended up becoming a huge city later on. So they were happy to find a cooler place because it's really hot in the summer if you're in the plains.
I can imagine. That's great. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Where
Any
can you buy
questions?
your book?
I think it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, they say there are 2 copies left.
Oh,
I just
okay.
bought
Well,
one of them.
you know what? Just send me an email and we'll get you a book. Don't worry. We'll get
No, 2
there'll be-
copies
I'm
enough
sure
for
that-
me, but I'm just
Right.
saying, there's no,
No,
you're sold out.
there are many more copies, but you just send me an email and we'll get you a book. Don't worry. Send me your address. We'll get you a book.
I appreciate the time that you spent with us, Omar. Thank you so much for that. It was one of the most interesting talks that I've heard in a long time. And again, it was about a part of the world that I knew virtually nothing about. So it was even more entertaining and educational. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and good luck to all of you and hope to see you again. And if you need anything or have any questions or want a copy of the book, please just email me. All the best.